Chapter 5, Act 5, The Betrayal. Act 5, The Betrayal. Cecil. Hey, Cecil. Why haven't you found me yet? 3 days since you betrayed Baron. Am I as easy to forget as your vows to the king?
NGGG. Arg.
Cecil suddenly kicked his blankets off and shot up in bed, sweat dripping down his forehead. He had been hearing it all night. Kane's taunting voice going in and out of his dreams. It sounded just like the Kane he had known his entire life. But then again, there was something a little twisted about it.
Good morning, Cecil,
a singing voice called out. Cecil gasped in surprise as Rosa stepped inside his room. Her appearance had taken a total 180 from the day before. Her hair was luscious and shiny again, spilling over her shoulders from a high ponytail. Her usual hair ornaments were arranged just so, ancient jeweled pieces that had been passed down in her family for generations, and of course her trademark diamond tiara sat regally over her forehead. But now, instead of wearing a fancy gown or her archery practice suit, she was wearing a pink silk bustier leotard, a leather belt around her waist to carry potions and arrows, white knee-high leather boots encrusted with more jewels, and flowing pink and white gossamer capes that hung from elegant ivory shoulder plates. She looked like the goddess of the hunt, Diana. Rosa smiled and sat down next to Cecil in bed, handing him a small package. Her wrists were wrapped in beautiful pink silk ribbons that brought out the apples of her cheeks.
I got this for you in town, Cecil. Thanks.
Cecil took the package and slowly unwrapped it. Inside was a single pearl earring.
For your pierced ear,
Rosa smiled gently, taking the earring out of the box and pushing back Cecil's hair so she could put it in.
It's supposed to raise your vitality as well. An old wives' tale, I'm sure, but just in case.
Just the touch of her fingertips on his earlobes made him feel like he was about to spontaneously combust. How the hell had he thought it would be a good idea for him to keep an eye on Rosa again? Sure, he wouldn't spend needless time worrying about her, but how was he going to convince her he was too dangerous for her if his body betrayed him every time she touched him?
I remember you boys had that silly dare to see who could stay on that wild forest chocobo the longest, and the loser had to get his ear pierced by the other.
Rosa laughed, pushing the earring in the hole Kane had gouged in Cecil's lobe the day he lost that bet. She clicked the fastener into place and sat back.
Perfect, it suits you.
Cecil looked away. Kane was still a sore subject, thanks to his dream.
Have you seen Kane, anyway? No, of course not since you two left together,
Rosa replied, and then let out a little gasp.
Wait a minute. You mean you and Kane didn't split up to protect the crystals? I was under that impression when I didn't see him with you. No, it was hardly willingly,
Cecil explained, getting up from the bed and going into the water closet to prepare a pitcher of hot water to wash his face and hair. There was no way he was going to attempt to bathe otherwise with Rosa right there. He turned on the water and waited for the pitcher to fill.
We got separated at the earthquake and missed. I haven't seen him since. I woke up with Rydia, alone, and came to Capo immediately to protect her from further danger. But it was here in Capo that we got attacked by Baronian soldiers and found you unconscious.
The water pitcher filled, Cecil then returned to the main room to heat it over the fireplace.
We were told to go to Damcyan to get the sand ruby to cure your fever. That was when we witnessed Damcyan getting destroyed by the Red Wings. And you pretty much know the rest of the story from there. My God.
Rosa shook her head.
So much has happened in the past few days. The day you and Kane left was when Golbez arrived. Unfortunately, I never saw him, I just heard talk of him from the other ladies in my magic lessons. Edward saw him,
Cecil said, taking the now heated pitcher back into the water closet and pouring it into the sink.
He said he was dressed in armor that was like the dark of night. Well, all I hope is that Kane is safe and sound,
Rosa sighed.
I miss him terribly.
Cecil resisted sneering as he splashed his face with the water, but couldn't help but make a biting retort.
Yeah, well, don't you think you would be safer with Kane anyway? What?
Rosa blinked and walked to the doorway of the water closet.
How could you say something like that?
Cecil pretended not to hear her and dunked his head under the water. As he squeezed his eyes shut, he willed his heart not to break any more than it already was. Rosa stared at him anxiously from the doorway, but suddenly turned away when hurried footsteps rushed into the room.
Rosa, here you are.
Rydia exclaimed, throwing her arms around Rosa's long legs.
I thought you were at the Covington's place. I awoke early and wanted to say goodbye to Mr. and Mrs. Covington in my own way by making them breakfast,
Rosa smiled.
and I wanted to do a little shopping of my own since you guys had all the fun last night.
Oh, so Covington was their name. Cecil thought as he lifted his head from the water. I guess I was in too much of a hurry to ask.
It wasn't that fun, Lady Rosa,
a tired Edward replied as he came in as well.
Rest assured, you were much better off than us. Edward, you look like you've seen a ghost,
Rosa said gently.
Did you sleep okay last night? Oh, Lady Rosa. I'm normally this pale, I assure you,
Edward laughed.
It's just been a rough 24 hours. I will be fine now, I promise.
Rosa nodded and patted him on the shoulder.
Just let me know if you need anything, Edward. I know you have had a devastating loss.
She kissed him on the cheek and looked back toward Cecil.
Cecil, are we to depart soon? Yes, we'll leave right now,
Cecil replied, exiting the water closet and grabbing his supplies and helmet.
Edward, do you know the way to Mount Hobbs? Yes, I'll drive,
Edward said.
I've already checked us out of the inn as well.
Rosa laughed and grabbed Cecil's hand.
Oh Cecil, it's almost like you're the prince and Edward is the knight.
Cecil made a tsking noise and pulled his hand away, exiting the inn. Outside of Capo, the group climbed into the hovercraft and began the journey over the northern sea shoals to Mount Hobbs. Rydia was twitching nervously in her seat next to Rosa. Cecil had volunteered to sit up front with Edward. Maybe the ice will be gone. Please, let it be gone. Rydia silently prayed to whoever out there was listening. But she had no such luck. The looming, grey Mount Hobbs leered over them, and indeed, just a couple of yards into the pathway upwards, an unbelievably thick wall of ice was blocking their way.
How did this even get here?
Cecil demanded, scraping a bit of ice with the tip of his sword.
Well, we believe it appeared when the water crystal was taken from Mysidia.
Edward trailed off, having gotten the faintest hint from Rosa that Cecil was behind some of Baron's evil at one point in time. He was sure Cecil hadn't done it on purpose, he could immediately tell that Cecil was a good man, but he didn't want to start any trouble.
Things going out of balance, and such. Oh. Well,
Cecil pulled back his sword and shut up. He could tell Edward was pussyfooting around the subject.
Rydia,
Rosa smiled, putting her hands on Rydia's shoulders.
Will you try to cast fire?
Rydia shook her head.
Rydia.
Edward offered a weak smile of his own.
You can do it, I know you can,
Rosa said. Rydia stomped her foot and threw Rosa's hands off her shoulders.
Yeah, well, I don't want to cast fire.
Rydia shrieked. Rosa's eyes widened, but she didn't back down.
You don't want to? I hate fire.
Rydia cried, tears springing to her eyes. All of a sudden she felt so childish, as much of a coward as Prince Edward had been. Rosa stepped back and Cecil leaned in, whispering.
Her village was destroyed by fire. By the ring cane and I delivered.
Rosa looked over at Cecil. Suddenly, she realized why Cecil had been even more on edge than usual. The king had tricked him into spilling even more blood. She bit down on her lip, and then kneeled down so she was Rydia's height.
Rydia. Dear, you are the only one here who has the power to melt this ice,
Rosa said softly. Rydia sniffled and wiped her nose on the hem of her dress.
We can't make you do it. But unless we make it through here to Fabul, even more people could be hurt. I know it is not easy, Rydia. But please, you must be brave.
Rydia sniffled again and Edward gently touched her shoulder.
Yes. We all must be brave. Right.
Rydia closed her eyes. She could do this, couldn't she? Couldn't she be brave like Prince Edward was when he had to leave Anna? And Edward was being much nicer than she had been to him.
Please, Rydia.
Rosa smiled a little more.
You are the only one who can do this.
Edward exclaimed. Rydia looked from Edward to Cecil. Cecil resisted the urge to look away from her emerald saucer eyes and gave a slight nod. I don't want any more kids to be orphans, like me. And Edward. And Cecil. Rydia took a breath and pushed past Rosa, raising her hands and calling out in a loud, clear voice.
Fire!
Bursts of red and orange flames erupted from the ground below the ice, reaching up and feeding upon it as if it were firewood. In a matter of seconds, the ice had melted away, and Rydia had a big smile on her face.
I did it. Of course you did it.
Rosa laughed and gave Rydia a tight hug.
Thank you, Rydia. That was incredible.
Edward gave a thumbs up. Cecil gave a smile, which he knew Rydia couldn't see behind his helmet, and turned toward the path.
Come on everyone. Fable is just to the east. These monsters are just never-ending.
Rosa cried, wiping her brow as she reached into her quiver for another arrow. She aimed for a mere second and then shot the arrow off, which landed in the heart of a cockatrice attempting to dive-bomb them. The cockatrice shrieked and fell from the sky down the mountain. Cecil had gone ahead to clear the path, which was littered with even more undead monsters than they had seen in the underground waterway with Tella. Cecil didn't want to let on to anyone else, but he was already exhausted and he could tell that the undead were easily resisting his dark power. Every time he struck a blow, he felt as if his strength was being sapped away from him. What the hell was going on with his body? Was the power of the dark blade weakening? It was a bit easier to hide his fatigue since Rydia was now thoroughly enjoying being able to light monsters on fire, and that was an undead's weakness, but... Meanwhile, Edward would attempt to lure any monsters to sleep with his harp or use his music to drive them mad enough to attack each other, but when things got too rough, he could very handily disappear. It wasn't exactly a talent, but it was made very clear early on that Prince Edward was not even remotely combat inclined.
I just need to rest for one moment, sirs,
Edward moaned, collapsing against the side of a steep incline.
I've never done so much in my entire life. Edward.
Rydia wrinkled her nose.
Must you act so princely all the time? Ahhhhhhhh.
With a loud thud, something crashed in the bushes next to where Rosa had been standing. She leaned in and screamed, stumbling backwards.
Oh my god! It's a body! What?
Cecil cried, rushing over and pulling the bushes apart. Sure enough, the crumpled body of some sort of soldier was there, his neck clearly broken by the bizarre twist it had taken on. He was dressed in blue and orange garb, with an orange mask obscuring his face. Cecil looked up toward where the body had fallen. In the distance, he could hear shouts and voices, but they were all coming from one man.
Something is going on above us,
Cecil said, pulling Rosa away from the body, where she was still staring, shell-shocked.
We need to investigate. Stay here while I go up.
Cecil began to climb higher up the incline. When he had finally reached the top, he came face to face with a tall, muscular man who was bare-chested and covered in red tribal tattoos. The only hair he had on his head was a thin ponytail of blonde at the top of his head, which was twisted into a braid. He had dark blonde eyebrows knitted into a grimace over his blue eyes, and his upper lip was obscured by a thick blonde mustache. He had red ruby orbs hanging from his ears. Behind him a horde of bombs and grey bombs were laid to waste on the ground, along with a few men who were dressed the same as the one who had fallen below. Cecil raised his eyebrows, not quite sure to make of the scene.
What is all this?
Cecil finally asked.
Oh. That garb. Monks. Of Fable, right.
Edward suddenly exclaimed, climbing up beside Cecil.
I thought I told you to stay down there.
Cecil started.
Hut. Ha.
The monk suddenly did a backflip in the air and roundhouse kicked a gigantic bomb that had floated behind him. Rydia popped up next, and then Rosa.
That's no ordinary bomb.
Edward cried.
We must help him.
Rydia exclaimed. She raised her ice rod and screamed blizzard. The spell hit the mom bomb, causing it to explode into 6 baby bombs. Cecil raced forward and began slashing at every blur of red and blue he could see. Rosa shot arrows into the sky, and the mysterious monk's legs moved so fast that Cecil could hardly keep track of which enemy he was taking on. In a matter of moments, the bombs all deflated, defeated, and fluttered to the ground before bursting into glittering dust and blowing away. The monk dusted his pants off and approached Cecil and the others.
You have my deepest gratitude,
he said. His voice was deep and soothing.
My name is Yang Fang Liden. I am Grand Master of the Monks of Fable. We had come here for training, and found death instead. A great host of monsters appeared and waylaid us. I am the only one who survived. My monks were all fine, strong men, but even they could do little.
Rosa gasped and covered her mouth.
We are on our way to Fabul,
Cecil said.
A man named Golbez has taken control of Baron, and is using its forces to seize the world's crystals.
Yang crossed his arms over his chest.
And you think he intends to come for our air crystal as well? Yes.
Edward burst out.
He has already taken the fire crystal from Damsion, and Fabul will be next.
Yang nodded, still being unbelievably calm about the entire situation. It made Cecil uneasy, even though he knew it was probably just a part of his discipline as a monk.
And our monks, slain? The castle is all but undefended. The few who remain in Fabul lack proper training. We would have no hope of fending off a strike from Baron if they were to attack now.
Yang stroked his mustache, deep in thought.
Golbez might have even sent those monsters that attacked you,
Rosa said softly.
Of course,
Yang nodded and sighed.
To eliminate us and leave Fabul defenseless. If it is true, then he might be moving against Fabul as we speak,
Edward said.
We'll aid you however we can,
Cecil said,
but we must hurry. I am grateful for the offer,
Yang began, looking Cecil up and down,
but there is no reason for you to be dragged in any further than this. Our stake in this conflict is no less than yours,
Edward said.
I am the Prince of Damsion. Damsion has been decimated by Golbez and the Red Wings, and I am one of very few that remain of my people. Rosa and I are of Baron,
Cecil explained,
and this child here lost all that she knew because I allowed the enemy to deceive me.
Rydia looked down and bit her lip. Yang nodded and uncrossed his arms.
I see. Then I am most humbly willing to accept any help you are willing to provide. Fabul lies east beyond the mountains. We'll make our way at once.
Yang gestured for the group to follow him around the corner and down an eastern slope of the mountain. The kingdom of Fabul could be seen in the distance, a tall, grey structure surrounded by a moat and just off the shore of the northern oceans. The kingdom's flag, blue with the emblem of the monk's garb, was still flying high. It appeared that Baron had not made it yet. Yang remained silent the entire way. Cecil followed suit, trying to work out in his head just how exactly the five of them and some novice monks were going to stave off Golbez and the Red Wings. No wonder Yang had initially declined their help. Were they essentially walking into a suicide mission? As they reached Fabul's grounds, two monks raced from the castle gates toward Yang, panic in their voices.
Master Yang, Master Yang! The king is waiting for you. We saw you from the outpost but we didn't see any of your men. Very good, we shall see him right now,
Yang replied.
Thank you for looking out for us.
The two guards parted and followed the group back to the gates, which they opened for Yang and closed behind them. As they walked within the castle gates, Cecil was shocked to see groups of townspeople going about, talking to the soldiers and going into different rooms within the hall.
Our village is contained within our castle walls, to offer the ultimate in protection for our citizens,
Yang explained.
Most of the young men in the village wish to train to become monks, so we wish to make that dream as accessible to them as possible. That's wonderful,
Rosa said.
Will the people hide inside the village in here then? Yes, that is the plan, I believe,
Yang said.
They will be safe from whatever comes our way, I will assure that.
As they approached the throne room near the center of the castle, two more monks ran up to Yang and began chattering at once.
Master Yang, the king is waiting. We shall proceed, thank you,
Yang said, and the monks bowed and pulled open the throne room doors for them.
Everyone here respects Master Yang so much.
Edward sighed. He wondered what that felt like.
Yang.
King Fabul, a burly, muscular man in his later years, stood up from his throne and swept towards Yang. He had dark hair that was peppered with white and grey, and was clothed in deep violet robes. Yang bowed deeply and the rest of the group followed suit.
Please rise,
King Fabul said, and took his seat back on his throne.
You look disturbed, Yang, and the guards reported to me that your men have yet to return. I come with urgent news, Your Highness,
Yang explained.
A man named Golbez is coming here for the air crystal, with all the might of Baron behind him. What?
The king cried, standing back up from the throne.
Are you sure about this? These people before you came to warn us,
Yang explained.
Your Highness.
Cecil cried, stepping forward.
There is no time for introductions, your castle must be secured immediately.
The alarm in the king's eyes did not fade, but he did smile slightly.
Sir, your armor would have you for one of Baron's own dark knights. Why exactly should I trust you?
Yang raised his hand to silence Cecil and intervened.
Your Highness, their trustworthiness has already been proven. I lost my men on Mount Hobbs in a monster attack, and was fighting for my own life when they came upon me. They could have let me die, but they aided me instead.
Cecil, getting anxious, moved Yang's hand down.
The enemy will not wait as you do, I assure you. Please. You must believe us,
Rosa said softly. The king still did not look swayed. Edward stepped out from behind the crowd, and bowed gracefully.
Your Grace, it is an honor to see you again. It has been many a day. Prince Edward.
King Fabul gasped.
I'd hardly recognize you, you have grown tremendously since we last met. How does Damsyon fare? It has fallen,
Edward replied sadly, and King Fabul's face twisted into a frown.
The fire crystal is ours no more. I have lost my mother, my father, and my beloved fiancée, Anna. Please tell me that you will not let your land suffer the same fate as mine.
King Fabul closed his eyes and turned away, reaching up and removing his crown. He held it against his heart for a few moments, and took a deep breath.
Forgive me. I only found it hard to believe you spoke the truth, but it seems you do. Still, without our monks, there is little we can do. Will you aid us in our defense? These men have strength and courage to match,
Yang explained,
and by your leave, I would like to have them stand by my side in our first line of defense. If that is your wish, I trust your judgment.
King Fabul nodded.
As for the two ladies, would you be willing to aid our healers? Certainly,
Rosa nodded, and Rydia gave a little bow. The king sighed, and slipped his crown back upon his head.
Then, the fate of my kingdom is in your hands,
he sighed.
Yang, if you do not mind, I will be warning the queen and working to gather the women and children into safety first. Leave everything to us, your highness,
Yang said smoothly.
Cecil, Edward. With me.
Yang turned to leave the throne room and lead them to the quarters of the remaining monks. Rosa reached out and grabbed Cecil's hand, reaching up with her other to slide open the visor on his helmet.
Cecil,
Rosa whispered,
please be careful.
Cecil nodded, and looked to Rydia.
Rydia, protect Rosa for me, okay? Yes.
Rydia exclaimed, and waved to the men as they marched out. Rosa looked at Rydia, and sighed.
Don't worry, Rosa.
Rydia smiled.
Cecil told me when he met me that he would protect me, so he won't let anything happen to us.
Rosa smiled weakly and nodded.
Of course, Rydia.
Outside the castle, Yang, Cecil, and Edward were stationed at the front gates with some guards above them in towers. None of the men had spoken a word since they discussed their strategy on the way to visit the monks and explain the situation. They had determined that they should keep Baron outside the castle as long as possible and as a very last resort allow them to get as far as the throne room. The king was hidden safely in his quarters along with the queen and the women and children. The rest of the villagers were either helping watchguard or fight, or hiding within the shops and basements inside the castle. The air crystal was within a hidden chamber behind the throne room.
Look out, enemies approach!
One of the guards suddenly cried from above. Cecil withdrew his blade, while Yang readied his fists and Edward took a defensive stance, ready to provide healing as necessary.
Attack!
Yang cried, and they rushed the Baron's soldiers as they came over the moat. Cecil struck down everyone in his path, knowing that if he looked anyone in the eyes and saw someone he once knew, he wouldn't be able to go on. But mixed in with the soldiers were monsters as well, which made things all the more difficult. Edward frantically created salves and healing potions, tossing them to Yang and Cecil as they pushed back the first wave.
We did it!
Yang exclaimed, but before they could gain their bearings, another guard shouted, "The Red Wings are here!" Explosions and the sound of crashing rock filled the air, and Cecil instinctively covered his head with his arms.
We'll die like dogs out here!
Cecil shouted.
Retreat to the keep!
Yang called, and the group, along with the monks, scrambled inside, surrounding the gate that led to the village within.
Forgive me for drawing you into this hopeless fight.
Yang moaned, shaking his head.
I told you before, this fight is ours as much as anyone else's,
Cecil replied,
and we haven't lost yet. Oh God!
Edward gasped as the gates started to shake.
They're breaking through.
Another wave of soldiers and monsters burst through the gate, knocking the monks in training aside like rag dolls. The struggle to keep them back was much more evident this time, and it was only when Edward managed a successful lullaby on his harp to make the remaining enemies fall asleep that they could fall back and escape.
Isn't the throne room just upstairs?
Cecil asked as they backed into the hall.
Yes, but not to worry, there is no one there,
Yang said.
We need only draw the enemy here.
At once the door broke down, splintering into hundreds of pieces as a group of Baron captains slashed it apart, their swords glimmering with fresh blood.
And crush them.
Cecil charged forward, summoning a powerful dark wave to at least take out the monsters who had slipped in with the captains. But when more started pouring in, Yang called that they needed to fall back once last time. Cecil slowly backed toward the door, sweat pouring down his forehead as Edward grabbed him and pulled him through the rest of the way. A monk that slipped in with them rushed forward to lock the door as the Baronian soldiers and monsters banged upon it.
Cecil, take this,
Edward exclaimed, handing him a specially mixed potion.
You doing okay? I'm fine,
Cecil sighed, taking a long swig and throwing the bottle on the floor.
But now we're in the throne room, we'll have to hold our ground this time.
The monk, who had been leaning against the door as Cecil, Edward, and Yang discussed how to hold the throne room, casually pulled the key from his pocket and unlocked it with a loud click.
What are you doing?
Yang cried, and the monk laughed as he shed his clothes and transformed into a Sahajan. Yang defeated it in one swift kick, but it was too late and now monsters and Baron's men were pouring in the throne room at an alarming rate.
Retreat!
Yang cried, backing towards the hidden chamber behind them.
We've no choice. We'll make our last stand in the crystal chamber.
Cecil followed suit, but as Edward ran towards the chamber, he tripped over the potion bottle Cecil had thrown on the floor.
Edward!
Cecil cried, rushing to his side as a horde of monsters ascended upon him. He dragged Edward out from underneath them, decapitating Aleshi in the process, and pulled him into the open door of the crystal chamber. Yang slammed it shut behind them, latching it. Then it was just the three of them. Despite the noise and the destruction occurring in the throne room, the crystal room was completely silent. Floating upon the mirrored pillar was the glittering blue air crystal, safe and sound. Yang sighed in relief and sat in front of the pillar, resting his head in his hands. Edward collapsed on the floor, his hands shaking as he tried to salve a wound he had gotten from one of the monsters while on the floor. Cecil paced back and forth, racking his brains on what to do next. We can't lose this, we just can't. If Golbez gets yet another crystal. Suddenly, they heard the warning click of a lock turning, and the crystal chamber door opened. Cecil withdrew his blade and pointed it towards the door, ready to strike.
It's been some time, Cecil.
Out of the shadows came not a monster, but Cain Highwind. Cecil gasped and dropped his sword, the loud clatter echoing throughout the chamber. He ran up to Cain and threw his arms around him, hardly believing what was in front of his eyes.
Cain, you're alive!
Cecil exclaimed, pulling back grinning for the first time since Cain had disappeared. Despite everything horrible that was happening just feet away, Cecil suddenly felt like everything was going to be right again. There was no way they could lose with Cain on their side.
Hi Cecil,
Cain replied. His face was smiling, but his voice was ice cold.
You're alive.
Cecil shook his head and grinned harder.
I mean, I knew you were, but... here you are. I am. You'll fight then, right?
Cecil asked.
Of course.
Cain smiled more.
That's the very reason why I've come, Cecil. But the one I will be fighting is you.
He gave Cecil a hard slap on the back, and Cecil stepped back, blinking.
Cain. A duel, Cecil.
Cain laughed manically.
What the hell do you mean?
Cain stopped laughing and pulled his lance, thrusting it so that the tip scraped Cecil's throat with a light ting against his armor. Cecil stumbled back, his mind racing. Yang and Edward just stared, not quite sure what to make of the events that were unfolding before them.
Draw your blade, Cecil.
Cain kicked the fallen dark sword over to Cecil. As Cecil hesitated to bend down and pick it up, Cain struck, leaping high up into the air and landing upon Cecil with a punishing blow to the head. Cecil cried out and fell to the floor with Cain on top of him and his head ringing. Cain stood up and kept his foot on Cecil's chest, laughing as he kicked the dark blade away back toward the door to the crystal chamber.
Why, Kane?
Cecil cried, feeling tears start to build in his eyes. Kane swung his lance again and gave Cecil another strike in the head. Cecil felt his head bang against the other side of his helmet and the putrid smell of blood began to fill his nostrils.
I will not answer your questions,
Kane hissed. He reached down and ripped the helmet from Cecil's head. Cecil gasped for breath as Kane pressed his foot down hard upon his chest, blood beginning to trickle from his temple to his eye.
What? What's come over you?
Cecil moaned. Kane shrugged and pointed the tip of his lance at Cecil's nose. Yang and Edward took a step closer, hesitating. If either of them struck hastily, Kane could easily finish off Cecil in one swipe of his lance.
This is the end, Cecil. Let me ease your suffering. It is the least I could do.
With a swift swing of the lance, there came a sickening crack as the base of the lance connected with Cecil's head. Fireworks exploded before Cecil's eyes as he tasted blood and plummeted into darkness. End of chapter. Chapter end.